The phone buzzed at 2 in the morning, and Claire knew before she picked it up that her life was about to change. She had been lying awake anyway, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above her, listening to Daniel breathe beside her in the dark. He always slept so easily. That had bothered her for months, though she could not say why. A man who slept that well, she thought, was either innocent or very good at pretending. The message was from a number she did not recognize. 3 words. "We need to talk." Nothing else. No name. No explanation. Just those 4 words glowing on the screen like a warning light on a dashboard. Claire sat up slowly, careful not to wake Daniel, and slipped out of the bedroom with her phone clutched in her hand. In the kitchen, under the dim glow of the stove light, she typed back a single question. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly, as if the person on the other end had been waiting, watching the message deliver, counting the seconds until she responded. "My name is Nora. I think you should know something about your husband." Claire's hand went cold. She had heard whispers before, small comments from friends who quickly changed the subject, a perfume on Daniel's collar that was not hers, late nights that stretched longer than any project could explain. She had pushed all of it down, buried it under 11 years of marriage, 2 children, a mortgage, a life built brick by brick. She had told herself she was imagining things. Now a stranger was typing into her phone at 2 in the morning, and the ground beneath her was shifting. She agreed to meet Nora the next afternoon at a small coffee shop across town, a place neither of them would likely be recognized. Claire told Daniel she was meeting an old friend from work. He barely looked up from his laptop when she said it, already lost in whatever conversation was happening behind the screen, a conversation Claire now suspected was not about work at all. The coffee shop smelled of cinnamon and burnt espresso. Claire arrived early and chose a table near the back, away from the window, where she could watch the door without being seen easily. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. She rehearsed what she might say, though nothing felt right. There was no rehearsed line for a moment like this. When the door opened and a young woman stepped inside, Claire knew immediately. It was something in the way the woman scanned the room, searching, nervous, the same nervousness Claire felt sitting in her chair. The woman was younger than Claire had expected, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back and an expression that looked more frightened than triumphant. Claire had imagined many versions of this moment, and in most of them the other woman looked confident, even smug. This woman looked like she might turn and run. "Claire?" the woman asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. Claire nodded once and gestured to the empty chair across from her. "You must be Nora." Nora sat down carefully, as if the chair itself might reject her. She placed her phone face down on the table, then folded her hands in her lap, then unfolded them again. Claire watched all of this without saying a word, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, because she wanted to see what Nora would do with discomfort. It told her something about a person, how they handled silence. "I didn't know," Nora said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About you. About the marriage, not at first. He told me he was separated. He told me the 2 of you were living in the same house only because of the children, because you couldn't afford to move out yet. He said it was over between you both a long time ago." Claire almost laughed, though nothing about this was funny. She had heard this story before, though not from Daniel directly and not about herself. She had heard fragments of it from other women, other confessions whispered over the years, though she had never let herself connect them fully until this moment. Now, sitting across from Nora, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. "How long have you known him?" Claire asked. 8 months, Nora said. "We met at a work conference. He was funny, attentive. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. I hadn't met anyone like that in a long time." She paused, her eyes dropping to the table. "He told me he loved me 3 weeks ago. He said it like he meant it. Like it was the first time he'd ever said those words to anyone." Claire felt something twist inside her chest. Not quite jealousy, not quite grief, but some strange combination of both. She thought of the early days of her own marriage, when Daniel had said those same words to her under a string of fairy lights at a friend's wedding, his voice cracking slightly with what she had believed at the time, was pure emotion. "He told me the same thing," Claire said quietly. 11 years ago. He said it like it was the first time too." Nora looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Claire took a slow breath, deciding how much to say, how much this stranger deserved to know before Claire herself fully understood the shape of what she was about to reveal. She thought about the women who had come before, the ones she had suspected, the ones she had confirmed over the years through careful, quiet investigation that she had never told anyone about, not even her closest friends. She had kept those discoveries locked away, telling herself each time that it was the last time, that Daniel had changed, that the marriage was worth protecting despite everything. "You're not the first," Claire said. "You're not even the second or the third." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either woman had expected. Nora's face went pale. She reached for her water glass but did not drink from it, just held it, as if needing something solid to grip. "What do you mean?" Nora asked again, though this time her voice cracked on the last word. "I mean exactly what I said," Claire replied. "He has done this before, more than once. He tells women he loves them. He tells them the marriage is over, that he's only staying for the children, that it's complicated, that he just needs time. And then eventually he comes home. Every single time he comes home." Nora set the glass down carefully, her hand no longer trembling but rigid, controlled, the way a person moves when they are trying very hard not to fall apart in public. "3 said that before you," Claire added, almost to herself, the words tasting strange and bitter on her tongue, as though speaking them aloud made them more real than she wanted them to be. 3 women sat exactly where you're sitting now, in one form or another, believing exactly what you believed. And I stayed, every time I stayed." The coffee shop around them continued as if nothing had happened, a barista calling out a name for an order, the hiss of a milk steamer, the low murmur of other conversations that had nothing to do with the quiet devastation unfolding at the back table. Claire watched Nora absorb the information, watched the exact moment when disbelief gave way to something closer to horror, the realization spreading across her face like a slow-moving storm cloud. "Why are you telling me this?" Nora finally asked. "Why not just let me find out on my own the way you did?" Claire considered the question carefully before answering. It was fair, and she did not have a simple response ready. Part of her had wanted to confront Daniel directly, to scream, to demand answers, to finally break the pattern of silence she had maintained for years. But something else had pulled her toward this meeting instead, some instinct she did not fully understand yet. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was solidarity, maybe it was simply exhaustion, a desire to stop carrying this burden alone. "Because I'm tired," Claire said. "I'm tired of being the only one who knows the truth. I'm tired of watching him do this again and again while everyone else believes he's the man he pretends to be. Maybe if you know now, before it goes any further, you can decide what to do with your life before he decides it for you." Nora looked down at her hands, turning them over slowly as if searching for some kind of evidence, some proof that any of this was real. "He proposed a trip," she said quietly. "Next month. He said we would finally tell people. He said he was ready." Claire felt her stomach drop, though she was not entirely surprised. Daniel had always been a planner, a man who understood the value of grand gestures, of promises wrapped in just enough detail to feel believable. She remembered her own version of that trip years earlier, before the pattern had revealed itself, before she understood what those promises actually meant. "He told me the same thing once," Claire said. "A trip to somewhere neither of us had been. He said it would be the start of a new chapter. I believed him completely." "What happened?" Nora asked. "The trip never happened," Claire said. "Something always came up, a work emergency, a family obligation, something urgent that could not wait, and by the time the excuse resolved itself, the urgency of the trip had somehow resolved itself too. It simply stopped being mentioned as though it had never been promised at all." Nora's eyes filled with tears that she fought hard to keep from falling, blinking rapidly, pressing her lips together. Claire recognized the effort. She had spent years perfecting that same skill, the art of holding herself together in public while everything inside her quietly broke apart. "I don't understand," Nora said. If you knew all of this, why did you agree to meet me? Why didn't you just confront him yourself and end it there? Claire considered the question again, turning it over slowly. She thought about the years she had spent protecting a version of her marriage that existed mostly in her own mind. A version built on hope rather than evidence, on the memory of who Daniel used to be rather than who he had clearly become. She thought about her children, about the life they had built together, about the fear of starting over that had kept her rooted in place long after she should have walked away. "Because I think this time might be different," Claire said finally. "Not because he's changed, he hasn't. But because you reached out to me instead of hiding, instead of pretending you didn't know I existed. That tells me something about you that the others never showed me. Maybe together we can end this the right way, instead of me carrying it alone the way I always have." Nora looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, a decision forming slowly, carefully, the way decisions form when a person finally understands the true shape of their situation. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Claire glanced toward the window, watching the afternoon light shift across the parking lot outside, watching ordinary people walk past living ordinary lives, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place just beyond the glass. She thought about Daniel at home, likely still on his laptop, likely unaware that the two most important women in his carefully constructed double life were sitting together at this very moment, comparing notes, assembling the truth he had spent years hiding from both of them. "I think," Claire said slowly, "it's time he finally learns that some patterns cannot be repeated forever. Sooner or later, someone always notices." Nora nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, sitting up a little straighter than she had when she first walked through the door. Whatever fear had brought her to this meeting was beginning to transform into something else, something steadier, something that looked almost like resolve. Neither woman knew yet exactly what the coming weeks would bring, how deep the deception truly ran, or how many more layers of the truth still waited to be uncovered. But for the first time in a long while, Claire did not feel entirely alone in the fight ahead. And for Nora, the fairy tale she had believed in for 8 months was quietly, irreversibly, beginning to crumble. Outside the coffee shop, the afternoon carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened, though for both women at the back table, everything had just changed. Daniel arrived home just after 7 that evening, whistling as he walked through the front door, a bag of takeout in one hand and his phone in the other, thumb still scrolling as though the outside world could not wait even a few seconds longer for his attention. Claire watched him from the kitchen doorway, studying the ease in his shoulders, the casual confidence of a man who believed his secrets were still safely buried. "Long day," he said, setting the bag on the counter without looking up. "Sorry I'm late, meetings ran over." Claire said nothing at first, simply watching him unpack the food, watching the practiced rhythm of a routine he had performed so many times it no longer required thought. She wondered how many of his late meetings over the years had truly been meetings at all, and how many had been something else entirely, dressed up in the language of work so that no one would think to question it. "I met someone interesting today," Claire said finally, keeping her voice light, almost conversational. Daniel glanced up, his expression unreadable, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Oh, who?" "Her name is Nora," Claire said, watching his face carefully now, cataloging every twitch, every shift in posture. "She works in event coordination, very sweet, very trusting." The color drained from Daniel's face, so quickly it would have been almost comical under different circumstances. He set down the container of food he had been holding, his movements suddenly stiff, mechanical, as though his body had not yet caught up with the panic clearly forming in his mind. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though the words came out too fast, too rehearsed, the tone of a man reaching for a script he had not fully prepared. "That's strange," Claire said, "because she certainly seemed to know exactly who I was. She even knew about our children. Knew the name of the street we live on. Knew quite a lot, actually, for someone you claim not to know." Daniel's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply staring at the counter as though the answer to this sudden crisis might appear written somewhere among the takeout containers. Claire had seen this look before, though she had never fully understood it until now. It was the look of a man calculating, weighing which version of events might still be salvageable, searching for an angle that could turn the conversation back in his favor. "It's not what you think," he said finally. "You don't know what I think," Claire replied evenly. "But I'll tell you what I know. I know her name is Nora. I know you've been seeing her for 8 months. I know you told her the marriage was over, that we were only staying together for the children. I know you promised her a trip next month, the same kind of trip you promised me years ago, right before it quietly disappeared." Daniel's expression shifted from panic to something closer to defensiveness, his shoulders squaring slightly, his chin lifting in the particular way it always did when he felt cornered. Claire recognized this transformation too. She had watched it happen before, though never over something quite this significant. "You've been checking my phone," he said, his voice sharpening, "going through my things behind my back." "No," Claire said calmly. "She reached out to me, last night actually, around 2 in the morning. She wanted me to know the truth before things went any further, before she found herself trapped in something she never fully understood." For a moment Daniel looked almost relieved, as though this detail somehow changed the situation in his favor, gave him room to maneuver. "She's clearly unstable," he said. "Reaching out to my wife in the middle of the night like that should tell you something about her state of mind." Claire felt something harden inside her, a resolve settling into place that had been building for years, layer by layer, betrayal by betrayal, until it had finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored or explained away. "It tells me she has more integrity than you do," Claire said. "She could have stayed quiet. She could have let this continue for months, maybe longer. Instead, she reached out to me directly. That took more courage than you've shown in years." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to realize that whatever he said next would only dig him deeper into a hole already too large to climb out of. He turned away from her, running a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps toward the window before turning back. "Fine," he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Yes, I made a mistake. I got caught up in something I shouldn't have. But it doesn't mean anything, Claire. You're my wife. You're the one I chose. This other thing, it was just a distraction. A stupid distraction that got out of hand." Claire almost laughed, though there was no humor left in her at all. "That's interesting," she said, "because that's almost word for word what you told me about the woman before her, and the one before that. Do you even remember their names anymore, Daniel? Or do they all blur together after a while?" His face went white again, the confirmation of what Claire had long suspected but never spoken aloud settling over the kitchen like a heavy fog. "How do you know about them?" he said quietly. "I've always known," Claire said. "Every single time. I found out about the first one nearly 9 years ago through a message left on your old phone that you thought you had deleted. I found out about the second one through a hotel receipt tucked into the pocket of a jacket you asked me to take to the dry cleaner. I found out about the third one because a friend of a friend recognized you somewhere you weren't supposed to be. I have known for years, Daniel. I simply chose not to say anything because I believed, foolishly, that each time would be the last." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, filling every corner of the kitchen. Daniel sank slowly into a chair at the table, his earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced by something closer to defeat, though Claire suspected it was defeat born more from being caught than from any genuine remorse. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. "All these years if you knew. Why didn't you ever leave?" Claire considered the question carefully, because it deserved an honest answer even now, even after everything. "Because I loved the man I thought you were," she said. "Because we built a life together, and I believed that life was worth protecting, even when the man at the center of it kept failing to protect it himself. Because I told myself that people can change, that everyone deserves another chance, and I kept giving you chance after chance, hoping eventually you would prove me right." "I can prove you right," Daniel said quickly, reaching across the table toward her hand, though Claire pulled back before he could touch her. I can, just give me the chance. I'll end things with Nora completely. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Claire studied him for a long moment, searching his face for something that might have once convinced her, some flicker of the man she had married 11 years earlier. She found only desperation now, the desperation of someone caught rather than someone genuinely sorry. That's exactly what you said the last time, she said quietly. And the time before that. I believed you every single time, Daniel, but I'm done believing. Nora and I already spoke about this. She knows the truth now. She knows about the others. Whatever happens between the two of you, it won't happen with the same lies you've been telling for years, because those lies no longer work on either of us. Daniel's face shifted again, panic returning at the mention of Nora knowing everything, of the two women having compared notes, of his carefully separated worlds suddenly and irreversibly colliding. What did you tell her? He asked, his voice tight. Everything, Claire said simply. Every detail I've collected over the years, every pattern, every excuse you've ever used, laid out clearly enough that she'll recognize it instantly the next time you try it, whether with her or with whoever comes after her. There won't be anyone after her, Daniel said quickly. I promise you that. Claire almost smiled at the absurdity of it, a man who had broken every promise he ever made now offering yet another promise as though it carried any weight at all. You've made that same promise 3 times before, she said. Perhaps it's time you finally understand that promises only matter when they're kept, not when they're repeated. She turned and walked toward the hallway, leaving him sitting alone at the table with the cooling takeout and the wreckage of a secret finally exposed. Behind her, she heard him call her name once, then again, his voice cracking slightly with something that might have been genuine emotion or might simply have been the panic of losing control over a situation he had spent years carefully managing. Claire did not turn around. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something close to clarity, a sense that the fog she had been living inside for years was finally beginning to lift. She did not yet know what came next, whether this would be the moment she finally left for good, or whether old habits and old fears would pull her back into the familiar cycle one more time. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty as she closed the bedroom door behind her. Nothing about tonight would ever be forgotten by either of them, no matter what happened next. Meanwhile, across town, Nora sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone, waiting for a message from Daniel that had not yet arrived. She thought about the conversation with Claire, about the calm, steady way the other woman had spoken, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted honesty that felt more convincing than any accusation could have been. She thought about the trip Daniel had promised, about the words he had whispered to her only weeks earlier, words that now felt hollow, rehearsed, borrowed from some earlier version of the same performance. She picked up her phone and opened her messages, scrolling back through months of conversations with Daniel, reading them now with entirely new eyes. The compliments that had once felt spontaneous now looked calculated. The promises that had once felt sincere now looked like patterns, phrases repeated in slightly different forms, as though pulled from some well-worn script he had used many times before. Her phone buzzed suddenly, and her heart jumped, though not with the excitement she once would have felt. It was a message from Daniel. Just 3 words, the same 3 words that had started everything only a day earlier, though this time they carried an entirely different weight. We need to talk. Nora stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone face down on the table beside her, choosing, for the first time since she had met him, not to answer right away. Somewhere across the city, Claire was making the same choice, lying awake in a house that no longer felt entirely like home, wondering what tomorrow would bring, and whether either of them was finally ready to end a pattern that had repeated itself for far too long. Morning came gray and quiet, the kind of light that made everything look slightly unfinished. Claire stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching the street outside as if it might offer some kind of answer. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments of the last 11 years replayed themselves, small moments she had dismissed at the time, now rearranging into a pattern so clear she wondered how she had missed it for so long. She thought about the first woman, a coworker named Priya who had transferred departments rather suddenly 9 years earlier, right around the time Claire had found that deleted message. She thought about the second, a woman she had never met, only glimpsed once from a distance outside a hotel, her identity confirmed only through the crumpled receipt in Daniel's jacket pocket. She thought about the third, whose name she still did not know for certain, only a description passed along second-hand through a friend of a friend who had seen Daniel somewhere he should not have been. 3 women, 3 separate lives disrupted, and Claire had known about each one and said nothing, choosing silence over confrontation, choosing the fragile comfort of denial over the difficult work of change. She realized now, standing in her kitchen with cold coffee in her hands, that her silence had not protected her marriage at all. It had simply given Daniel permission to continue, again and again, each time with a new woman who believed she was different, special, the one who would finally make him stop. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Nora. "Can we meet again? I need to understand more." Claire typed back a simple reply, agreeing to meet at the same coffee shop later that afternoon, then set the phone down and finished dressing for work, moving through her morning routine with the strange, disconnected feeling of a person performing familiar tasks while their mind exists somewhere else entirely. She dropped the children at school without mentioning anything unusual, kissed them both on the forehead, and drove to her office where she sat through meetings without absorbing a single word that was said. By the time she arrived at the coffee shop that afternoon, Nora was already seated at the same back table, a notebook open in front of her, pages filled with handwriting that Claire could not quite read from a distance. Nora looked different than she had the day before, less fragile, something sharper and more focused in her expression. "I went back through everything," Nora said as Claire sat down. "Every message, every conversation. I wrote down every promise he ever made me, every excuse, every story about why we couldn't be seen together yet." She turned the notebook around so Claire could see the pages, lines of careful handwriting organized into columns, dates on one side, quotes on the other. "I want to know how many of these match what he told you, or what he told the others." Claire studied the notebook for a long moment, an odd mixture of admiration and sorrow rising in her chest. She had never thought to document things this way, had simply carried the knowledge privately for years, letting it calcify into something heavy and unspoken. Seeing Nora's methodical approach felt like watching someone finally do the work Claire herself had avoided for far too long. "Read me some of them," Claire said. Nora ran her finger down the page. "He told me his marriage had been unhappy for years before he met me. He said the two of you slept in separate rooms most nights. He said you both knew it was over but stayed together for practical reasons, mostly financial, and because neither of you wanted to disrupt the children's lives too suddenly." Claire shook her head slowly. "We've shared a bedroom every night of our marriage except when one of us was sick, and he's never once mentioned wanting to leave, not to me. If anything, he's always been the one pushing hardest to keep things looking perfect on the outside, even when everything underneath was falling apart." Nora continued down her list. "He said he was planning to tell you the truth soon, that he just needed the right moment, that he didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily until he had a proper plan in place." "He said some version of that to me too," Claire said quietly, though directed at someone else entirely. "He told me once that an old friend had been pursuing him relentlessly, that he had turned her down repeatedly, that he simply hadn't found the right way to make her understand he wasn't interested. I believed him at the time. I actually felt sorry for him, having to deal with someone so persistent." She paused, the memory settling uncomfortably in her chest. "I understand now that story was probably about the second woman, told from the opposite direction entirely." Nora set down her pen, her hand trembling slightly. "How does someone become so good at this?" she asked, more to herself than to Claire. "How does someone build an entire structure of lies this elaborate and keep it running for years without collapsing?" "Practice," Claire said simply. "And people willing to believe him, because the alternative, accepting the truth, is so much harder to face." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the coffee shop continuing around them, oblivious to the quiet dismantling taking place at the back table. Claire studied Nora's face, searching for signs of what might come next, uncertain whether this alliance between them would hold or whether old habits, old hopes, might eventually pull Nora back toward Daniel despite everything she now understood. "What are you going to do?" Claire asked finally. Nora closed the notebook slowly, running her hand across its cover as though sealing something inside. "I'm going to end it," she said. "Today, I already told him we needed to talk. I think he suspects something, based on how quickly he replied." She looked up at Claire, something steady forming in her expression. "What about you? Are you going to end it too?" Claire had asked herself this question 100 times since the previous night, turning it over from every angle, weighing 11 years of marriage against a pattern that showed no sign of ever truly stopping. She thought about her children, about the home they had built, about the fear of starting completely over at this point in her life. But she also thought about the exhaustion of carrying this secret alone for years, the slow erosion of trust that had left her feeling like a stranger inside her own marriage. "I don't know yet," Claire admitted. "Part of me wants to walk away completely tonight without looking back. But another part of me keeps thinking about everything we've built together, wondering if there's some version of this where he actually changes, where this becomes the moment everything finally shifts for good." "You said yourself he's made that promise 3 times before," Nora said gently, though there was no judgment in her tone, only genuine concern. "I know," Claire said. "I know exactly what I said, and I know exactly how unlikely that outcome really is. But 11 years is a long time to simply walk away from without at least considering every possibility first." Nora nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation. She reached across the table and, after a brief hesitation, placed her hand gently over Claire's. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I don't think you should do it because you're afraid of being alone. I think you should do it because it's what's actually right for you, not for him, not for anyone else." Claire felt something loosen slightly in her chest at those words, a tension she had been carrying so long it had become almost invisible to her, woven into the fabric of her daily life. She looked at Nora, this stranger who had entered her life through such an unlikely, painful path, and felt an unexpected gratitude settle over her. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, "for reaching out, for being honest even when it would have been easier not to be." "Thank you for telling me the truth," Nora replied. "Even though it must have been difficult, sharing something you'd kept private for so long." Their phones buzzed almost simultaneously, both women glancing down at the same moment. Claire's message was from Daniel, 3 words again, though this time carrying an edge of desperation. "Please, we need to talk properly." Nora's message was longer, more pleading, Daniel clearly sensing that his carefully built world was collapsing faster than he could manage, reaching out to salvage whatever pieces he still could. The 2 women looked at each other across the table, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "I think it's time we both talked to him," Claire said. "But not separately this time." Nora's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face before settling into something like resolve. "Together." "Together," Claire confirmed. "Let him explain himself to both of us at once. Let's see how well his stories hold up when there's no one left to lie to separately." They agreed to meet Daniel that evening at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant across town where neither woman had any personal history, where Daniel would have nowhere familiar to retreat to, no comfortable territory to manipulate. As they gathered their things to leave, Nora paused, looking at Claire with something like curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Do you regret staying with him all these years, knowing what you knew?" Claire considered the question seriously, unwilling to offer a quick or dishonest answer. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "Ask me again after tonight." They left the coffee shop separately, walking in opposite directions down the street, 2 women who had entered each other's lives through betrayal, but were leaving, at least for now, with something that felt unexpectedly like solidarity. Neither of them fully knew what the evening ahead would bring, whether Daniel would offer some explanation that changed everything, or whether the confrontation would simply confirm what both of them already suspected deep down. But for the first time since this entire ordeal began, neither woman felt like she was facing it alone. That evening, as the sun began to lower over the city, Daniel sat in his car outside the restaurant, staring at the entrance, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He had rehearsed a dozen different explanations throughout the day, discarding each one as insufficient, aware on some level that no story, no matter how carefully constructed, could survive contact with two women who had already compared their separate versions of the truth. He thought briefly about simply not showing up, about disappearing entirely, starting over somewhere new where his history could not follow him. But something kept him rooted in place, some combination of pride, fear, and a stubborn belief that he could still talk his way out of this, the way he always had before. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, unaware that inside, Claire and Nora were already seated together at a table near the back, notebook open between them, comparing final details one last time, preparing for a conversation that would determine far more than either of them yet realized. Daniel spotted them the moment he walked through the restaurant doors, seated together at a corner table, heads bent close in quiet conversation. For a brief second, he considered turning around and walking back out, but the hostess had already noticed him, already offered a polite smile and asked if he was meeting someone. There was no graceful way to retreat now. He crossed the room slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, and pulled out the empty chair across from the two women who had, until recently, existed in entirely separate corners of his carefully divided life. Now they sat together, united by the very thing he had spent so much effort keeping apart. "Thank you both for coming," he said, attempting a tone of calm authority that neither woman found convincing. "We're not here for pleasantries," Claire said. "We're here because you owe us both an explanation, and we'd like to hear it at the same time, so there's no room left for separate versions of the same story." Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at Nora, searching her face for some remaining softness, some hope that she might still be persuaded, but found only steady resolve staring back at him. Whatever hold he once had over her seemed to have evaporated sometime between the previous night and this moment. "I know this looks bad," he began. "It doesn't look bad," Nora interrupted. "It is bad. There's a difference, and I think you understand that difference better than either of us." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the gesture that had once seemed endearing to both women now appearing calculated, a performance meant to project vulnerability rather than genuine feeling. "I never meant to hurt either of you," he said. "Things got complicated. I found myself caught between two situations I didn't know how to resolve." "Three," Claire corrected quietly. "You found yourself caught between at least 4 situations, Daniel, me, and 3 others before Nora. Let's not pretend this is some unusual complication. This is a pattern." The color drained from Daniel's face at the word pattern, spoken aloud now in front of both women simultaneously, stripped of any ambiguity. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly searching for some angle that might soften the accusation, but finding nothing that could survive the evidence already assembled against him. "Tell us about Priya," Claire said suddenly, watching his reaction carefully. Daniel flinched visibly at the name, a name Claire had never spoken aloud to him before, though she had known it privately for 9 years. "How do you?" he started, then stopped himself, seeming to realize the futility of denial at this point. "I've known for a long time," Claire said. "I've known about all of them for a long time. I simply chose silence, hoping each time might be the last. I was wrong every single time." Nora watched this exchange with an expression somewhere between fascination and horror, absorbing the full scope of Daniel's history in real time, understanding now that her own experience was not an isolated event but merely the most recent chapter in a much longer story. "How many women exactly?" she asked quietly. "How many times has this happened?" Daniel did not answer immediately, staring down at his hands folded on the table in front of him, silence stretching long enough to become its own kind of confession. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than either woman had ever heard it. 4, he admitted. Including Nora. Including you, Claire, obviously, though that's different. Is it? Claire asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks remarkably similar every time. Daniel had no answer for that. The waiter approached to take drink orders, glancing between the three of them with the polite obliviousness of someone unaware they had walked into the middle of a reckoning years in the making. All three declined, and the waiter retreated quickly, sensing something in the tension at the table that made him eager to leave them alone. Why? Nora asked, once the waiter had gone. I need to understand why you do this, not to forgive you. I don't think I could ever forgive this. But I need to understand, because right now none of it makes sense to me. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something that sounded almost like genuine confusion, as though he himself did not fully understand the answer he was about to give. I don't know, he said. I think, somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that feeling wanted was the same thing as being happy. Every time things at home felt routine, felt ordinary, I found myself drawn toward something that felt exciting again, something new. And once I started down that path, it became easier to keep going than to stop and face what I'd already done. That's not an explanation, Claire said. That's a justification. There's a difference. I know, Daniel admitted quietly. I know there's a difference. I just don't have anything better to offer you. The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the confession settling over the table like a heavy fog. Claire studied Daniel's face, searching for something familiar, some trace of the man she had married 11 years earlier, but finding instead a stranger she was no longer certain she had ever truly known. I think, Claire said slowly, that this conversation has answered every question I came here with. I don't think there's anything else you can say tonight that would change what I already know to be true. Claire, please, Daniel said, reaching across the table toward her hand, though she pulled back before he could touch her, the same way she had the night before in the kitchen. I need time, Claire said. Away from you, away from this house, at least for a while. I need to think clearly without you standing in the room trying to convince me of something I already know isn't real. Nora, watching this exchange, felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow settle over her. Relief that the truth had finally been fully exposed, sorrow for the years Claire had spent carrying this weight alone, and a quiet gratitude that she herself had escaped before investing years of her own life into a relationship built on the same foundation. I'm leaving now, Nora said, gathering her things. I don't think there's anything left to say between us, Daniel. I hope, for whatever it's worth, that you eventually understand the damage this has caused, not just to Claire, not just to me, but to everyone who came before us as well. She stood and walked toward the door without looking back, leaving Claire and Daniel alone at the table for the first time all evening. Claire watched her go, feeling an unexpected pang of loss at her departure, as though some fragile alliance had been the only thing holding her together through the events of the past 2 days. Claire, Daniel said quietly once they were alone, I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking anyway. Please. Claire looked at him for a long moment, studying the desperation in his eyes, trying to determine whether any part of it was genuine or whether it was simply another performance, adjusted now for an audience of 1 instead of 2. She thought about the years behind her, the pattern she had watched repeat itself again and again, the promises broken so consistently they had become almost predictable. I'm going to stay at my sister's for a while, Claire said finally, standing from the table. I need space to think without any pressure from you, without any more promises I know you won't keep. When I'm ready, I'll call you and we can talk about what comes next. But I need you to understand something clearly before I leave tonight. What? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This is the last time, Claire said. Whatever happens between us going forward, this is the absolute last time I give you the benefit of the doubt. If there is ever another woman, another late night that doesn't add up, another pattern I recognize too clearly, I will not stay silent again. I will not carry this burden alone anymore the way I have for years. Do you understand? Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with what might have been genuine remorse or might simply have been fear of the consequences finally catching up with him after years of careful evasion. "I understand," he said quietly. Claire gathered her purse and walked toward the exit, leaving Daniel alone at the table, surrounded by the remnants of a confession that had cost him more than he had ever anticipated when he first sat down that evening. Outside, the night air felt cool against her skin, and she stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing deeply, allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything that had just happened. She did not yet know what the coming weeks would hold, whether this separation would become permanent, or whether some version of reconciliation might eventually be possible. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that the silence she had maintained for so many years had finally, irrevocably, come to an end. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed once more. A message from Nora. "Thank you for tonight. Whatever happens next, I'm glad neither of us is facing it entirely alone." Claire smiled faintly despite everything, typing back a simple reply before starting her car and driving toward her sister's house, toward a future she could not yet fully see, but one that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely her own to shape. 2 weeks passed before Claire returned to the house, though not to stay. She came back only to collect more of her belongings, moving quietly through rooms that no longer felt entirely familiar, each object she touched carrying memories she was slowly learning to separate from the life she was building at her sister's home. Daniel was at work when she arrived, and she was grateful for the empty silence, grateful for the chance to move through the house without the weight of his presence pressing against her thoughts. Her sister Ellie had been a steady presence throughout the past 2 weeks, offering a spare room, quiet company, and the kind of patience that never once made Claire feel rushed toward any particular decision. Ellie had known, in vague terms, that something had gone wrong between Claire and Daniel, though Claire had not yet shared the full extent of what she had learned. It felt too enormous to speak aloud all at once, too many years of accumulated silence to unpack in a single conversation. It was during one of these quiet evenings at Ellie's kitchen table that Claire finally decided to tell her everything, laying out the full history as she understood it, from the first discovery 9 years earlier through the confrontation at the restaurant 2 weeks prior. Ellie listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to anger to something closer to heartbreak as the details unfolded. 9 years, Ellie said finally, once Claire had finished. "You've been carrying this alone for 9 years." "I thought I was protecting the family," Claire said. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if I gave him enough chances, eventually he would stop on his own, and no one would ever need to know how close we came to losing everything." "And now," Ellie asked gently. "Now I understand that my silence was never protecting anyone," Claire said. "It was only giving him room to keep going." Ellie reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand, the gesture simple but grounding, a reminder that Claire was no longer facing any of this entirely alone. "What do you want to do now?" Ellie asked. "Not what you think you should do, or what would be easiest, or what would protect appearances. What do you actually want?" Claire considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind the way she had many times over the past 2 weeks, though never quite arriving at a firm answer until this exact moment, sitting across from her sister in the quiet warmth of her kitchen. "I want a life that isn't built on silence," Claire said slowly. "I want my children to grow up understanding that love isn't supposed to require this much hiding, this much quiet endurance of things that should never have been endured in the first place." "That sounds like an answer to me," Ellie said gently. Claire nodded slowly, feeling the decision settle into place with a clarity that surprised her, given how uncertain everything had felt only weeks earlier. She would not be returning to the marriage, not in the form it had existed before. Whatever came next, whatever conversations remained to be had with Daniel about custody, about the house, about the practical details of untangling 11 years of shared life, she would face them from a place of strength rather than fear. Meanwhile, word of Daniel's exposed history had begun quietly spreading beyond the small circle of women directly involved. Nora, still processing her own heartbreak, had confided in a close friend from work, who happened to know one of the earlier women Daniel had been involved with years before. A woman named Priya who had transferred departments abruptly 9 years earlier under circumstances that had never been fully explained to her colleagues at the time. When Priya learned that her old story had resurfaced, connected now to two more recent women who had experienced strikingly similar deception, something in her finally shifted as well. She reached out to Nora directly, offering her own account of what had happened 9 years earlier, filling in details that even Claire had never fully known. The three women, connected now across nearly a decade of shared history with the same man, began exchanging messages, comparing notes, discovering just how consistent Daniel's patterns truly were across every relationship. The same phrases, the same promises, the same excuses deployed at nearly identical moments in each relationship's timeline. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of validation for all of them, a confirmation that none of them had been foolish or naive, but simply victims of a pattern refined and repeated with practiced precision over many years. Priya, now working in a different city entirely, offered a piece of information neither Claire nor Nora had previously known. There had been a fourth woman before her, someone Daniel had mentioned once during an unguarded moment early in their relationship, a woman he described only briefly before quickly changing the subject, as though the memory carried more weight than he wanted to acknowledge. "He told me her name was Sophie," Priya wrote in a message to the group the three women had quietly formed. "He said things ended badly, though he never explained exactly how. At the time I didn't think much of it. Now I wonder if she was simply the first in a line that never really stopped." Claire read this message late one evening, sitting alone in Ellie's spare room, feeling a strange, hollow ache settle in her chest. If Priya's account was accurate, that meant Daniel's pattern extended even further back than Claire had ever realized, predating their own marriage entirely. She had always assumed, on some level, that she had been the exception at the start, the woman he had genuinely loved before circumstances gradually eroded his commitment. Now she wondered whether even that assumption had been wrong, whether the pattern had simply been waiting, dormant, for the right pressures to reactivate it. She thought about reaching out to Daniel to ask directly about Sophie, but decided against it, uncertain whether she was ready to hear whatever answer he might offer, uncertain whether his answer would even be truthful at this point. Instead, she closed her laptop and sat quietly in the dark, allowing herself simply to feel the weight of everything she had learned over the past 2 weeks, without trying to immediately resolve it into some tidy conclusion. The following weekend, Claire finally agreed to meet Daniel again, this time not at a restaurant or a coffee shop, but at a mediator's office, the first formal step toward untangling the practical details of their shared life. Daniel arrived looking noticeably diminished from the confident man Claire had married 11 years earlier, his usual polish replaced by something more haggard, more uncertain. "I've been seeing a counselor," he said, once they were seated across from each other in the mediator's waiting room before the formal session began. "Trying to understand why I kept doing this, over and over, even when I genuinely loved you." Claire regarded him carefully, unsure whether to feel encouraged by this development or simply exhausted by yet another attempt to explain away years of accumulated harm. "That's good," she said finally. "I hope it helps you. But I need you to understand that whatever you learn about yourself in that process doesn't change what happens between us now. This isn't about giving you another chance to prove you've changed. This is about finally closing a chapter that should have closed years ago." Daniel nodded slowly, seeming to accept this without argument, a small but noticeable difference from his behavior during their earlier conversations. "I understand," he said. "I'm not asking you to reconsider. I think somewhere along the way I finally understand that this isn't something you owe me, no matter how many times I ask." The mediator called them into her office a few minutes later, and the conversation shifted toward practical matters: the house, the children's schooling, the gradual process of separating two lives that had been intertwined for over a decade. Claire moved through the meeting with a steady, businesslike calm that surprised even herself, as though some part of her had already fully accepted the ending long before this formal process began. Afterward, standing in the parking lot as the late afternoon sun began to lower, Daniel lingered near his car, clearly reluctant to end the conversation entirely. "Claire," he said, "for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not because I got caught, though I know that's easy to assume given everything. I'm sorry because I finally understand what I threw away, and how many people I hurt along the way to losing it." Claire studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the manipulation she had grown so accustomed to over the years, but finding instead something that felt, for once, genuinely quiet and reflective. Whether it was true remorse or simply the natural exhaustion of a man finally facing consequences he could no longer avoid, she could not say for certain. But she found, to her own surprise, that it no longer mattered as much as she once thought it would. "I believe you're sorry," Claire said finally. "But sorry doesn't undo 9 years, Daniel. It doesn't undo 4 women or however many more there might have been before any of us. I hope the work you're doing helps you become someone incapable of repeating this pattern again. But that work is yours to do now, not mine to wait around for." She got into her car without waiting for a response and drove away, watching Daniel grow smaller in her rearview mirror until he disappeared entirely from view. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she felt something close to peace settle over her, not because everything was resolved, but because she had finally, fully, stopped waiting for a different outcome than the one that had already, repeatedly, revealed itself to be true. Word of Daniel's history did not stay contained within the small circle of women who had lived through it directly. Workplaces are rarely as private as people assume, and within a few months, whispers had begun circulating among his colleagues, quiet conversations exchanged near coffee machines and in hallways, the kind of talk that never reaches the person it concerns until it has already shaped how everyone around them sees them. Daniel worked as a regional manager for a logistics company, a position built on trust, on his ability to represent the company honestly to clients and partners across several cities. It was a role that depended heavily on reputation, on the kind of quiet respect that took years to build and could unravel far more quickly than anyone expected. The unraveling began with a comment made carelessly at a company gathering. A colleague who happened to know Nora through a mutual friend, mentioning offhand that Daniel's personal life had recently become rather complicated. The comment spread quickly, as such things often do, gathering detail and speculation with each retelling, until the version circulating through the office bore only a loose resemblance to the actual events, though it captured the essential truth clearly enough. Daniel first noticed the shift in small ways. A colleague who used to stop by his office for casual conversation now offered only brief, polite greetings before hurrying past. An invitation to a team dinner that would ordinarily have included him arrived late, almost as an afterthought, and he found himself seated at the end of the table, slightly apart from the easy conversation flowing around him. He tried at first to ignore these shifts, telling himself he was imagining things, that his current stress over the separation was simply making him more sensitive to ordinary social dynamics. But the pattern continued, growing harder to dismiss with each passing week. A major client meeting he had always led was quietly reassigned to a colleague, the explanation offered vaguely, something about scheduling conflicts that did not entirely add up. It was during a private conversation with his supervisor, called into her office on a Tuesday afternoon under the guise of a routine check-in, that Daniel finally understood the full scope of what was happening. His supervisor, a measured woman named Grace who had always treated him with professional respect, chose her words carefully as she explained the concerns that had reached leadership. "There have been some conversations," Grace said, "about your judgment outside of work. I want to be clear that your personal life is your own business, and normally I wouldn't raise something like this at all. But when it starts affecting how clients and colleagues perceive your reliability, it becomes relevant to your role here." Daniel felt his stomach tighten, the familiar sensation of consequences catching up with him once again, though this time in a domain he had always considered separate from his personal failures. "I understand the concerns," he said carefully, But I don't think my personal circumstances should affect my professional performance. My numbers this quarter speak for themselves. They do, Grace agreed. Your performance has never been the issue. The issue is trust, and trust extends beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Some of our long-term clients have specifically requested a different point of contact going forward. I can't ignore that, regardless of how strong your numbers look on paper. Daniel left the meeting that afternoon with a clearer understanding than ever before of how thoroughly his choices had begun reshaping every corner of his life. Not just his marriage, not just his relationships, but the professional reputation he had spent over a decade carefully building. He sat in his car in the parking garage for nearly 20 minutes afterward, staring blankly at the concrete wall in front of him, trying to reconcile the version of himself he had always believed himself to be with the version that colleagues and clients now saw clearly enough to actively avoid. That evening, he called the counselor he had been seeing since the initial confrontation at the restaurant, requesting an emergency session despite the late hour. The counselor, a calm, unhurried man named Peter, listened patiently as Daniel described the events of the day, his voice tight with a frustration that gradually gave way to something closer to genuine distress. I keep thinking this is unfair, Daniel admitted during the session. My work has nothing to do with any of this. Why should something so personal affect how people see my professional abilities? Peter considered the question for a long moment before responding, his tone measured but direct. Because trust doesn't divide itself neatly into separate categories the way we might wish it did, he said. If someone learns you've maintained a pattern of deception in your closest relationships, it becomes reasonable for them to wonder what else you might be capable of hiding elsewhere. That's not unfair. That's simply how trust works once it's been broken. Daniel sat with this observation in silence for a long moment, something in it settling uncomfortably into place. He had spent years compartmentalizing his life so carefully, keeping each relationship separate, each lie contained within its own small box, convinced that as long as the boxes never touched, the damage could be managed indefinitely. Now, watching those boxes collapse into one another, he was beginning to understand just how naive that belief had always been. I don't know how to fix any of this, he admitted quietly. You may not be able to fix all of it, Peter said. Some consequences simply have to be lived with, not undone. But you can decide, starting now, what kind of person you want to become going forward, even if it takes years to rebuild any of what's been lost. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself increasingly isolated, both professionally and socially. Friends who had once included him easily in gatherings now hesitated, uncertain how to navigate a friendship that had always run parallel to his marriage, now dissolved amid revelations neither they nor Daniel had anticipated. Some friends sided quietly with Claire, having known her longer, having grown fond of her over the years in ways that made continued closeness with Daniel feel like a betrayal of their own. His relationship with his children, though never entirely at risk given their young age, took on a new complexity as well. Claire, careful never to speak negatively about Daniel directly in front of them, nonetheless found herself navigating difficult questions about why their father no longer lived at home, why weekends now involved careful scheduling between two separate households instead of the easy, uninterrupted family time they had always known. Daniel, for his part, began showing up for these scheduled visits with a newfound seriousness, arriving early, staying present in ways that surprised even Claire, who had expected, based on years of prior experience, that his commitment would eventually falter under the weight of inconvenience the way it always had before. Whether this shift represented genuine growth or simply the desperate final effort of a man determined to salvage whatever relationships remained available to him, Claire could not yet say with certainty. But she noticed it nonetheless, filing it away as one small data point among many still unfolding. Nora, meanwhile, had begun the slow process of rebuilding her own life, distancing herself gradually from the events of the past months, though the experience had left a lasting mark on how she approached new relationships moving forward. She found herself more cautious now, more attentive to inconsistencies, more willing to ask direct questions rather than accepting comfortable, romantic explanations at face value. She remained in occasional contact with Claire and Priya, the three women forming an unlikely but genuine bond through their shared experience, checking in with each other periodically, offering support during difficult moments, celebrating small victories as each of them slowly rebuilt lives that no longer revolved around the deceptions that had once connected them. It was during one of these periodic check-ins, nearly 4 months after the initial confrontation, that Priya shared a piece of news that shifted the entire situation once again. She had reconnected briefly with Sophie, the woman Daniel had mentioned in passing years earlier, the first known name in what now appeared to be a much longer chain of deception stretching back well over a decade. Sophie, it turned out, was willing to share her own story, one that predated even Claire's marriage to Daniel, offering a piece of the puzzle none of the other women had previously possessed. Her account, once shared, would reveal that the pattern went back even further than any of them had imagined, reshaping everything Claire believed she understood about the earliest days of her own relationship with Daniel, and raising uncomfortable new questions about just how much of their beginning had ever been genuine at all. Sophie agreed to meet Claire in person, a request Claire had made herself after learning of the connection through Priya. They arranged to meet at a quiet park on a mild afternoon, choosing open air and neutral ground over the enclosed intimacy of another coffee shop, as though both women sensed that whatever truths emerged from this conversation deserved space to breathe. Sophie arrived looking composed, older than Claire had expected, with the calm bearing of someone who had long ago made peace with a difficult chapter of her past. They sat together on a bench overlooking a small pond, watching children feed ducks nearby, an ordinary scene that felt strangely disconnected from the weight of the conversation about to unfold. "I dated Daniel almost 13 years ago," Sophie began, once the initial pleasantries had passed. "Before you, I assume, based on the timeline you described to Priya." Claire nodded slowly, doing the math in her head, realizing that Sophie's relationship with Daniel would have ended only shortly before Claire herself had met him. "What happened between you two?" Claire asked. Sophie was quiet for a moment, watching the ducks glide across the pond's surface. "We were together almost 2 years," she said. "Serious enough that we had discussed marriage, actually. And then, near the end, I discovered he had been seeing someone else for several months, someone from his gym, I believe. When I confronted him, he told me almost exactly what I imagine he told you at the beginning of your own relationship, that it meant nothing, that he had made a terrible mistake, that he loved me and only me." Claire felt something cold settle over her, the pattern extending backward now even further than she had imagined, reshaping the entire foundation of everything she believed about how her own relationship with Daniel had begun. "Did you ever meet the woman he was seeing?" Claire asked, though she already suspected she knew the uncomfortable answer forming in her mind. Sophie turned to look at her directly, something gentle but honest in her expression. "I never confirmed her name for certain," she said carefully. "But based on the timeline, and based on some things Priya mentioned about when you and Daniel first started dating, I've wondered for years whether it might have been you." The words landed heavily, though Claire found, to her own surprise, that they did not shock her as deeply as she might have expected only months earlier. After everything she had already learned, this simply felt like one more piece confirming a truth she had already begun to suspect on some level. She thought back to the earliest days of her relationship with Daniel, to a period when he had occasionally seemed distracted, distant, offering vague explanations about needing time to sort out some unspecified personal matters before their relationship could fully begin. "I remember him telling me he needed a few weeks before we could be exclusive," Claire said slowly, piecing the timeline together in her mind. "He said he was finishing something up, tying up loose ends from a previous relationship that hadn't quite ended cleanly." Sophie nodded slowly. "That would align almost exactly with when things fell apart between us," she said. "I'm sorry, Claire. I know this isn't easy to hear, especially after everything else you've already learned these past few months." Claire sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing this final piece of the puzzle, understanding now that her entire relationship with Daniel had likely begun the exact same way it would eventually end, with betrayal quietly woven into its very foundation, disguised as something new and hopeful. She thought about the early months of their courtship, the excitement, the sense that she had found someone truly different from anyone she had known before. All of it, it seemed, had been built on the same pattern that would go on to repeat itself again and again throughout their marriage. "Thank you for telling me this," Claire said finally. "I know it wasn't an easy thing to share." "I've carried this for a long time," Sophie admitted, wondering but never fully knowing. It helps in a strange way to finally have confirmation, even if the truth is difficult. The two women sat together for a while longer, watching the afternoon light shift slowly across the pond, exchanging smaller details about their respective experiences with Daniel, finding an unexpected comfort in the shared recognition of a pattern that had shaped both their lives so profoundly, even across a gap of more than a decade. Later that evening, Claire sat alone in her sister's spare room, reviewing everything she had learned over the past several months. The full scope of Daniel's history finally laid out before her with a clarity she had never possessed during their 11 years together. 4 women, possibly more, spanning well over a decade, each one believing at some point that she was the exception, the one who would finally be enough to end the pattern for good. Claire realized, sitting there in the quiet evening light, that she now faced a genuine choice, not simply about whether to reconcile with Daniel, a possibility she had already largely dismissed weeks earlier, but about what kind of story she wanted to tell herself about the years she had spent in that marriage. She could choose to view those 11 years as entirely wasted, built on a foundation of lies from the very beginning. Or she could choose to hold both truths at once, acknowledging the genuine moments of connection and happiness that had existed alongside the deception, without allowing either truth to fully erase the other. She thought about her children, about the life they had built together despite everything, about the version of family they would need to construct going forward, separate from Daniel but not devoid of meaning simply because the marriage itself had ultimately failed. She thought about Nora, about Priya, about Sophie, 3 women connected to her through shared pain, but also, unexpectedly, through a kind of solidarity that had helped each of them find clarity they might never have reached alone. Claire picked up her phone and opened a message thread she had created weeks earlier, a private group including herself, Nora, and Priya, with Sophie added just that evening following their conversation at the park. She typed a message slowly, choosing her words with care. "Thank you all for trusting me with your stories. I know none of us asked for this connection, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless. Whatever comes next for each of us, I hope we can carry forward something stronger than what brought us together in the first place." The responses came quickly, each woman offering her own version of gratitude, of solidarity, of quiet resolve to move forward from this chapter into something healthier, something built on honesty rather than carefully managed deception. Claire set her phone down and looked out the window at the darkening sky, feeling, for the first time in many months, a sense of genuine closure beginning to settle over the chaos of the past year. The formal divorce proceedings, when they finally began in earnest the following week, moved forward with a straightforward efficiency that surprised both Claire and Daniel, neither of them inclined toward the drawn-out conflict that so often accompanies the ending of a long marriage. Daniel, perhaps understanding at last the full weight of what his choices had cost him, did not contest the terms Claire proposed regarding custody and division of assets, offering instead a quiet, if imperfect, cooperation that felt like the closest thing to genuine remorse he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Claire found, in the weeks that followed, that she did not feel the devastation she had once feared she might. Instead, she felt something closer to relief, the particular relief that comes from finally setting down a burden carried for far too long. She began rebuilding her life deliberately, choosing a small apartment closer to her children's school, establishing new routines that felt entirely her own rather than shaped around someone else's patterns and preferences. Daniel, meanwhile, continued his work with Peter, the counselor, slowly beginning to understand the roots of a pattern that had shaped over a decade of his adult life. Whether this understanding would ultimately translate into lasting change remained an open question, one that only time could answer with any certainty. But for the first time in years, he appeared to be doing the difficult work of genuine self-examination, rather than simply managing the immediate consequences of being caught. As autumn settled over the city, Claire found herself, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, sitting in her new apartment with her children, watching them play a board game spread across the living room floor, laughter filling a space that felt entirely her own for the first time in years. Her phone buzzed briefly with a message from Nora, a simple photo of a sunset, no words attached, a small gesture of connection between two women who had found each other through the worst possible circumstances and emerged, somehow, with something resembling friendship. Claire smiled faintly, setting the phone aside, and returned her attention to the game unfolding on the floor in front of her, choosing in this quiet, ordinary moment to focus not on everything that had been lost over the past year, but on everything that remained, steady and true, ready to be built into something new. A year later, Claire stood in the kitchen of her small apartment, the same kind of quiet morning she had once spent staring out a different window, waiting for answers she had not yet known how to find. Now the silence felt different, chosen rather than endured, filled with the comfortable rhythm of a life she had built entirely on her own terms. She had grown close with Nora over the months that followed the divorce, an unlikely friendship that neither of them could have predicted the night they first met at a small coffee shop across town. They met regularly now, not to discuss Daniel, whose presence in both their lives had gradually faded into something manageable, distant, a chapter closed rather than an open wound. Instead, they talked about ordinary things, work, books, the small victories and frustrations of everyday life, the kind of friendship built on honesty rather than shared trauma alone. Priya remained in touch as well, though her life had moved in a different direction entirely. A new relationship blossoming in the city where she now lived, one she approached with a careful, clear-eyed attention that she credited, in part, to everything she had learned through the difficult process of finally understanding her own history with Daniel. Sophie, too, checked in occasionally, her message threads brief but warm, small reminders that the connection between the four women, forged through pain, had transformed into something genuinely valuable. Daniel continued his counseling, and from what Claire understood through the occasional necessary communication about their children, he appeared to be making real, if imperfect, progress. He had not, as far as anyone knew, repeated the pattern that had defined so much of his adult life, though Claire remained cautiously aware that time alone would ultimately prove whether this change was lasting or simply another chapter in a story that might, eventually, repeat itself with someone new. For Claire, the most important transformation had little to do with Daniel at all. She had learned, through the most painful path imaginable, the difference between loyalty and self-erasure, between patience and quiet suffering disguised as strength. She had learned that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, rarely protects anyone, and that sometimes the bravest choice is simply telling the truth, even when the truth threatens to unravel everything familiar. Her children were adjusting well, their lives settling into a rhythm split between two households that, despite everything, remained committed to their well-being above all else. They laughed easily, played freely, and showed no signs of carrying the weight their mother had carried alone for so many years, a small mercy that Claire recognized and appreciated more than she could easily express. On a warm evening that spring, Claire hosted a small gathering at her apartment. Close friends and family gathered together to celebrate nothing in particular, simply the quiet joy of connection freely chosen rather than obligated. Nora arrived with a bottle of wine and a warm smile, greeting Claire's children, as though she had known them for years rather than months. Ellie moved easily through the small crowd, proud of the sister who had rebuilt her life so thoroughly over the past year. Standing in her kitchen that evening, watching the gathering unfold around her, Claire felt something settle fully into place, a sense of peace that had taken over a year to build but now felt solid, unshakable, entirely her own. She thought back to that first 2 in the morning message, the 4 words that had shattered her carefully maintained illusions and set an entire chain of events into motion. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything she believed her life to be. Now, standing in a home she had built for herself, surrounded by people who valued honesty over convenient silence, Claire understood that it had actually been a beginning, the first difficult step toward a life built on truth rather than carefully managed deception. The pattern that had once repeated itself again and again throughout Daniel's adult life had finally been broken, not through his own initiative, but through the quiet courage of women who chose to speak honestly with each other rather than remain isolated in separate silences. Late that night, after the guests had gone home and her children were asleep, Claire sat alone on her small balcony, looking out over the city lights, her phone resting quietly beside her. She thought about the words that had once defined this entire ordeal, spoken almost a year and a half earlier in a quiet coffee shop across town. 3 said that before you. At the time, those words had felt like a warning, a confession of years of accumulated pain and endurance. Now, looking back, Claire understood them differently. They had not simply been a warning about Daniel's pattern of deception. They had been the beginning of something else entirely, an invitation for 2 strangers, connected through betrayal, to finally break a cycle that had persisted for far too long through silence and isolation. What began as heartbreak had transformed, slowly and unexpectedly, into solidarity, friendship, and ultimately, a kind of quiet strength that Claire had never known she possessed until circumstances demanded she find it. She rose from her chair as the night grew cooler, casting one last look over the city before heading inside to check on her sleeping children. Tomorrow would bring its own ordinary demands: work, school runs, the small daily tasks that make up an entire life. But tonight, Claire allowed herself simply to feel grateful for the truth finally spoken, for the connections forged through hardship, and for the life she had built piece by piece from the wreckage of a pattern that had finally, at long last, been broken for good.